Chloe walked slowly down the business class aisle, wearing the polished smile of a flight attendant long accustomed to hiding her true emotions behind a perfectly pressed uniform. When she was assigned to serve the two VIP seats, 1A and 1B, she had no idea that this seemingly ordinary duty would become the greatest turning point of her life. The cabin was quiet, the passengers refined, everything unfolding just like hundreds of flights before. Yet within that calm, a fateful storm was quietly taking shape. There are moments in life that feel like nothing more than another routine workday, until an unexpected truth surfaces and forces us to confront the past, to choose between silence and courage. This was a reminder never to ignore small signs, because they can lead us to truths powerful enough to change an entire life. As Chloe approached the VIP row, sunlight from the window fell across the face of the man seated in 1A, and in that instant, her breath caught. Something felt deeply familiar, not the admiration a flight attendant might feel for a first-class passenger, but an unease she couldn't quite name. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee tray down, her heart beating faster than usual. That face, those features were so strikingly familiar that old memories she thought long buried began to stir. Chloe told herself it was just a coincidence, that people are often misled by the past. But deep inside, a cold instinct whispered a warning. This flight would no longer be just another shift. It was the beginning of a truth that had been hidden for many years. Chloe tried to stay calm, but the feeling inside her was growing too strong to ignore. As the man in seat 1A leaned forward to take the coffee cup, a nearly unconscious reflex caused her hand to shift slightly. The hot coffee spilled, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to trigger a sudden, instinctive reaction. The man sprang to his feet, let out a short cry, and called her name in a way that sent a chill through her. It wasn't the voice of a stranger or a startled passenger. It was a voice Chloe had once heard every single day in her past. The business class cabin fell silent. Time seemed to slow. Their eyes met for only a few brief seconds, yet long enough for Chloe to catch the flicker of panic crossing his face. As she bent down to apologize, following standard procedure, her gaze unintentionally landed on an old scar on the man's wrist, a scar she had once bandaged in a cramped kitchen many years ago. In that moment, every doubt inside Chloe stopped being a vague feeling and became a question she could no longer avoid. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through words, but through small details that cannot be fabricated. And if you've ever believed the past could remain buried forever, stay with this story, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, because this is only the beginning of a truth about to be revealed. After that moment, Chloe forced herself to step back and continue her duties as if nothing had happened. But her heart was no longer in the cabin. It had been pulled backward into a past she once believed she had buried along with her tears. The man quickly changed his demeanor, lowering his head to adjust his clothes, avoiding her gaze as if afraid of being recognized. The woman seated beside him grew irritated, loudly complaining about the service, but Chloe barely heard a word. Her mind clung to a single detail. That scar could not be a coincidence. It was in the exact place, with a shape she knew too well, tied to a memory only two people who had once shared poverty and hardship could possibly know. Back in the crew preparation area, Chloe felt her legs grow heavy, as if every step dragged the weight of her past behind it. She tried to convince herself she was overthinking, that in a world of millions, a familiar face meant nothing, but that fragile logic quickly collapsed when she remembered the way the man had spoken her name. It wasn't how someone read a name from a badge. It carried a familiar cadence, an instinctive tone that couldn't be faked. A bold thought surfaced. Chloe opened the flight information system under the pretense of checking VIP service details. The words on the screen made her breath catch. The name listed for seat 1A was not the name she had once called during her marriage. It was an entirely new one. But when she scrolled down to the emergency contact section, a name she knew by heart appeared. a name she had never truly forgotten, no matter how hard she tried. It was the name of the woman who had once stood at her door, forcing her out into the rain. The woman who had declared that her son was dead, and that Chloe no longer had any right to exist in that family. In that moment, every fragment of Chloe's memories began to fall into place in a terrifying way. If this man was not a stranger, if the death she had been told about years ago was never real, then were the 5 years of poverty, humiliation, and silent suffering simply the price she paid for a lie constructed too perfectly to question? Chloe stood frozen in the aircraft cabin, realizing that this flight was not merely carrying passengers to their destination, it was propelling her straight toward a truth that could change her life forever. Standing frozen in the middle of the aircraft cabin, Chloe could no longer lie to herself. The present began to blur, giving way to memories from 5 years earlier, the day she believed her life had ended alongside a cold, silent funeral. That day, the sky was heavy and gray. Rain fell in thick sheets, as if the world itself were conspiring with her misery. In front of Chloe stood a sealed coffin, never opened even once. There was no final farewell, no face to look at one last time. Her mother-in-law stood beside her, her voice hoarse from crying, insisting that her son had burned to death in a horrific accident, so badly that no one could identify the body. Chloe wasn't clear-headed enough to question anything then. Grief and fear wrapped around her, and she believed every word she was told. She knelt before the freshly covered grave, convinced that the man she had once loved was gone from this world forever. But before her tears had even dried, a second tragedy was already waiting. When Chloe returned to the small house she once called home, she found her belongings thrown onto the porch, soaked by the rain. Her mother-in-law stood in the doorway, her eyes cold, declaring that from that moment on, Chloe had no right to stay. All the property, insurance, and money belonged to her. There was no explanation, no chance to argue. On the very day she buried her husband, Chloe was pushed out into the street. 5 years later, standing on that flight, the memory returned with painful clarity, and for the first time, Chloe realized that the funeral years ago may not have buried just one man, but also a truth she had never been allowed to know. After the day she was thrown out of the house, Chloe entered a chapter of life she rarely allowed herself to revisit for long. For the first 3 days, she slept curled up at a bus stop, clutching the only handbag she had left, her mind looping around a single question: how could everything have ended so quickly? With no family, no money, and no clear explanation, Chloe had to learn how to survive from absolute zero. She found work washing dishes at a small restaurant, working from early morning until late at night in exchange for leftover meals and a temporary place to sleep. Some nights, she was so exhausted that the moment she lay down, she burst into tears, not from hunger, but from the crushing feeling of being completely abandoned. During the few rare breaks she had, Chloe taught herself foreign languages using old books she borrowed from the library. She believed that if there was any way out of that life, it would have to come through knowledge and persistence. Slowly, year by year, she pulled herself up from the deepest pit of despair. She took entrance exams, learned a profession, and eventually put on a flight attendant's uniform, something that had once felt like a distant, impossible dream. Yet even as her outward life changed, the wound inside her never truly healed. Every flight, every passenger's face reminded Chloe that the past can be buried, but it never disappears. That was why, when she came face to face with the man in seat 1A, all the years she had tried to forget surged back at once. She began to realize that her 5 years of suffering might not have been cruel fate alone, but the result of a cold, deliberate arrangement. And if that was true, then the pain she had endured should not end in silence. It deserved an answer and a fair reckoning for her own life. That realization made it impossible for Chloe to keep treating everything as a closed chapter of sorrow. The scattered fragments of her past began to connect with the present in a frightening way. If the man on that flight truly was her husband from years ago, Then the death she had believed in might have been nothing more than a perfectly staged performance. Chloe recalled the details she had once ignored because of her grief. Never being allowed to see her husband's face one last time, the coffin kept sealed at all times, the insurance paperwork rushed through by her mother-in-law without letting Chloe take part. Back then, she had assumed it was simply the cruelty of circumstance, never suspecting that something darker might have been hidden beneath it all. Now, standing between two timelines, Chloe understood that her innocence had unknowingly sustained a lie for 5 long years. She had blamed herself, believing she was weak, incapable, not strong enough to hold on to her happiness. But if the truth was that she had been deceived, then the fault did not lie in weakness. It lay with those who had exploited her trust to escape responsibility. For the first time, something shifted quietly inside her. Fear began to give way to clarity. She was no longer just a woman pushed around by fate, but someone standing before a question that demanded an answer. If 5 years ago she had been silent because she had no choice, then now she understood that silence would only allow the truth to be buried once again. From that moment on, a clear resolve took shape within her. No matter how cruel the answer might be, she had to face it, because only when the truth was finally exposed would the years of suffering she endured truly have meaning. That resolve didn't come from a sudden impulse. It grew out of the painful clarity of someone who had already lost too much. Chloe understood that if she turned away now, if she dismissed everything as a terrifying coincidence, then the rest of her life would be spent living with an unanswered question. She would keep flying, keep smiling at passengers, while deep inside, a quiet suspicion smoldered, never fully extinguished. And that, she realized, would be the true prison. During the remaining hours of the flight, Chloe forced herself to work with professionalism. She served, cleared trays, and spoke with practiced courtesy, yet her gaze never strayed far from the VIP seats. The man seemed to sense the tension as well. He avoided her eyes, spoke in low tones to the woman beside him, and occasionally glanced at the name badge on her chest, as if trying to reassure himself. That avoidance only strengthened Chloe's certainty that her instincts were not unfounded. When the plane landed, passengers began to disembark in the familiar, orderly flow. Chloe stood at her post, offering final polite smiles. The man from seat 1A passed close enough for her to hear his breathing. In that brief moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but Chloe saw the panic hidden beneath his confident exterior. It was not the look of a stranger, it was the look of someone afraid of being recognized. After the aircraft door closed, Chloe remained still for a few seconds, as if grounding herself in reality. She knew that from this moment on, her life could never return to what it had been. If she chose to move forward, the path ahead would be risky, perhaps even dangerous. But if she stopped now, the 5 years of suffering she endured would forever remain meaningless. Chloe took a deep breath and told herself that the truth, even when delayed, still deserved to be revealed. And sometimes, to reclaim justice for oneself, a person must step outside their comfort zone, no matter how terrifying the secrets they are forced to face. That night, when Chloe returned to her cramped rented room after the long flight, the sense of unease still refused to leave her. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Just then, her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen, short, cold, and sent with the absolute certainty that it would be read. It didn't need a long explanation. It said just enough for Chloe to understand that someone was watching her. Before she could steady herself, a second message arrived. This time, it was a photo. Chloe opened it, and her heart seemed to drop straight into her chest. It was the door to her room, photographed in the dark. The angle was low, the hallway light faint, illuminating the lock perfectly. The image was so clear there was no denying it had been taken only moments earlier. Cold sweat broke out along her neck. Chloe jumped to her feet, locked the door, pulled the curtain shut, and turned off most of the lights. Every small sound from the hallway made her flinch. The room she knew so well suddenly felt unfamiliar and suffocating. For the first time in many years, Chloe felt real fear, not the fear of memory, but fear that existed right there in the present. In that moment of panic, she understood that the truth she had touched on the plane had made someone unwilling to stay silent any longer. From that second on, this was no longer just a hidden past. It had become a danger moving closer to her life. Chloe sat motionless in the darkness for several minutes before daring to touch her phone again. When the screen lit up, a new notification appeared. This time, it wasn't a direct threat, but a transfer alert. The amount was large, enough to make anyone struggling hesitate. Beneath it was a single, blunt message, cold and unmistakable: stay silent or disappear. No emotion, no argument, just an order, delivered by someone who clearly believed they held the power to decide. Chloe read the words over and over, her heart pounding. She had never imagined that the quiet life she fought so hard to rebuild could be violated so easily. But what truly sent a chill through her wasn't the money, it was the sender's name displayed clearly on the transaction screen. A name painfully familiar, bearing the very surname she had tried to forget for 5 long years. In that instant, every last trace of doubt inside Chloe disappeared. If she had still wondered whether she was imagining things, the answer was now undeniable. No innocent person sends money to silence a stranger, and no one uses that surname unless they are directly tied to the past Chloe had just begun to uncover. She set the phone down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. The initial fear slowly transformed into a deep sense of violation. 5 years of suffering, 5 years of clawing her way up from nothing, now reduced to a sum of money and a cold threat. Chloe understood that the choice had been placed squarely in front of her: accept silence in exchange for temporary safety, or move forward and confront what was being so carefully hidden. And this time, she knew there was no turning back. As her thoughts spiraled, a soft sound near the door made her flinch. Through the narrow gap beneath it, a brown envelope had been pushed inside. No sender's name, no postal mark. Chloe stood still for several seconds before bending down to pick it up, unease spreading through her body. Inside the envelope was a stack of yellowed medical documents, photocopied from many years ago. Her heart slammed in her chest as she saw a familiar name printed at the top of the first page. Chloe read each line slowly, as if rushing even a little might cause everything to collapse. The documents were Ethan's medical test results, conducted shortly before the time he was supposedly declared dead. The conclusion was brief but unmistakably clear. According to medical evaluation at that time, he was unable to father children. The papers slipped from Chloe's hands onto the table as her breathing grew heavy. In that instant, 5 years of memories crashed over her like a violent wave. She remembered the accusations, the contemptuous looks, the whispered judgments that she was useless, that she was the reason the family had no heir. She remembered blaming herself, silently carrying guilt she never dared to question or resist. And now she realized that all of it had been built on a truth deliberately concealed. That medical envelope was more than paperwork. It was confirmation of an injustice Chloe had carried for years. It explained why she had been treated with such cruelty, why she had been cast aside so quickly after the funeral. And more importantly, it showed her that she had never been the one at fault. For the first time in 5 years, Chloe felt a clarity so sharp it hurt. The truth may arrive late, but once it does, it forces you to re-examine your entire life from a completely different perspective. Chloe knew she could no longer face this alone. The envelope on the table felt like a warning that the truth had grown larger than her ability to carry it by herself. After several minutes of hesitation, she picked up her phone and called Leo, the lawyer who had once handed her his business card after a past flight. A moment she had thought was nothing more than casual politeness. Leo's voice on the other end of the line quickly turned serious as he listened to Chloe recount everything, from the fateful flight to the threatening messages, and finally, the test results that changed everything. From their very first conversation, Leo quickly identified the true nature of the situation. This was no longer a personal conflict or a family misunderstanding. It was a chain of actions that showed clear signs of serious legal violations: faking one's own death to disappear from a marriage, collecting insurance assets, assuming a new identity, and then attempting to intimidate the person who knew the truth were all acts that could carry criminal liability. Leo's calm, methodical analysis was the first thing that made Chloe feel she was no longer standing alone against an invisible force. But the tone of the call shifted when Leo brought up the detail of the new wife. Based on what Chloe had shared, the woman was pregnant and already had a child. Leo paused for a few seconds before saying carefully that, given the medical test results Chloe was holding, that situation would be impossible if the man were truly the biological father. That contradiction opened an entirely new direction, one that went beyond personal betrayal and pointed toward even more complex legal consequences. When the call ended, Chloe sat quietly in her small room, but her mindset had changed. The fear was still there, yet alongside it was something clearer, the feeling of someone who had just realized she had the right to demand the truth. And from the moment Leo entered the story, Chloe understood that the road ahead was no longer just a personal search for answers, but a path toward bringing 5 years of carefully constructed lies into the light. After the night when the truth began to surface, Chloe realized she could no longer confront what lay ahead as the woman she used to be. If she wanted to move deeper into the world where those lies were still operating, she had to change the way she appeared. Under Leo's careful guidance, Chloe temporarily stepped away from her familiar routine, erased the traces that were easy to recognize, and began living under a new identity. The name Chloe, so tightly bound to pain and the weakness of her past, was set aside. In its place, she chose the name Kate. Short, neutral, distant enough to sever ties with memory, yet confident enough to move through spaces of wealth and power. Kate emerged with an entirely different presence, no longer the modest flight attendant hiding behind a professional smile. She now carried herself with quiet elegance and control. Her hair was neatly styled, her clothing refined, every detail carefully chosen, not to flaunt, but to signal that she belonged among successful, discerning people. This wasn't deception. It was a necessary armor, allowing Kate to step into circles Chloe had never been able to approach before. Beneath that exterior, Chloe's wounds and vigilance remained intact, but instead of letting fear lead her, she learned to observe and wait. Changing identities wasn't just about a new name or new clothes. It was a shift in mindset. Kate no longer waited for pity or for justice to arrive on its own. She stepped onto the board deliberately, accepting that to reach the truth, one sometimes has to pass through doors the past once sealed shut. Looking at herself in the mirror, Chloe saw that the woman staring back was no longer the victim she had been 5 years earlier. Under the name Kate, she carried a clear purpose, not revenge fueled by rage, but a calm, methodical pursuit of the truth, guided by the clarity she had paid for with immense loss. As Kate, Chloe took her first careful steps into the private world of the woman now living the life that once should have been hers. Their encounter took place at a luxury spa, a space wrapped in soothing scents and an atmosphere of carefully curated calm. Chloe didn't force the meeting. She sat quietly in the waiting area, allowing a deliberate coincidence to do its work. When Olivia appeared, her polished appearance failed to hide the fatigue lingering behind her eyes, and Chloe knew she had chosen the right approach. The conversation began with simple pleasantries, then slowly drifted into more personal territory, as if the two women had known each other for years. Chloe spoke little and listened more, keeping her tone gently empathetic without sounding intrusive. That calm presence made Olivia open up quickly. She spoke of a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt suffocating within, of a husband who was always busy and emotionally distant, and of a mother-in-law who interfered in every decision the family made. These words weren't spoken out of weakness, but because Olivia needed someone, anyone, to be on her side. Chloe realized that beneath the polished surface, Olivia was also a lonely woman trapped inside her own marriage. As the conversation continued, the distance between them quietly dissolved. Chloe offered no direct advice, only small acknowledgments and thoughtful responses that made Olivia feel truly heard. Before they parted, it was Olivia who suggested they stay in touch, calling Chloe a friend. Walking out of the spa, Chloe knew the first door had opened. Not through confrontation or pressure, but through listening. In a world built on carefully constructed lies, sometimes the shortest path to the truth begins by becoming the person the other side trusts most. The relationship between Chloe, under the name Kate, and Olivia progressed faster than even Olivia seemed to expect. Casual check-in messages turned into a habit, brief coffee meetings became routine, and Chloe could feel trust being built piece by piece. It was during one seemingly ordinary conversation that Olivia made an unexpected invitation, one that forced Chloe to steady herself so her emotions wouldn't show. Olivia invited her to attend the celebration of her 5th wedding anniversary with her husband, a lavish event planned with close friends and business partners. Chloe smiled and responded with just the right amount of enthusiasm, but inside, her heart suddenly felt heavy. The date printed on the invitation was no coincidence. 5 years earlier, on that exact day, Chloe had been forced to sign papers relinquishing all rights connected to her former marriage, while still believing her husband was dead. She remembered signing with trembling hands, not because she fully understood the document, but because she had no choice. The coincidence made Chloe realize that fate was placing her back at the very beginning, but this time, in an entirely different position. 5 years ago, she had walked out of that house with nothing but humiliation she couldn't even name. Now she was being welcomed into the center of the celebration as an invited guest. Chloe understood that this invitation was more than a social event. It was a doorway straight into the world where lies had been carefully constructed and protected for years. And as she folded the invitation closed, Chloe knew that the anniversary party would not only mark 5 years of someone else's marriage, it would be the moment she came face to face with the past that had once destroyed her. The anniversary party unfolded in a luxurious setting where soft music and polished congratulations wrapped the room in an illusion of perfection. Chloe entered the hall as Kate, composed, unhurried, her expression calm, as if this were nothing more than a routine social gathering. But the instant she appeared, the two figures on the stage froze. Ethan, mid-toast with his glass raised, stiffened as his color drained in a split second. Beside him, the older woman, Chloe's former mother-in-law, also went still, her shock unmistakable as her eyes met the face she had believed erased from her life forever. The panic passed quickly, but it was enough. Chloe knew she had been recognized. Ethan forced a strained smile, his hand tightening around the wine glass as if anchoring himself. His mother turned away, avoiding Chloe's gaze, her lips pressed thin, as though one more second of eye contact might cause every secret to collapse. Yet surrounded by hundreds of guests, media, and business partners, they had no choice but to continue their performance. Chloe understood that this was her greatest advantage. In this space, Ethan couldn't raise his voice, couldn't drive her away, couldn't create a scene without drawing suspicion. Every move he made was bound by the image he had spent years carefully constructing. Chloe moved forward slowly, keeping a measured distance, offering a polite smile, just another properly invited guest. In that moment, Chloe realized the balance had begun to shift. 5 years ago, she had been cast out in silence. Today, her calm presence alone was enough to unsettle those who had once pushed her into ruin. And this party, without a single word yet spoken, had already become the place where the truth could no longer hide. Chloe didn't rush to act. She understood that in a crowded space like this, well-timed silence could be far more unsettling than any accusation spoken aloud. As the music softened and attention briefly drifted away from the stage, Chloe calmly took out her phone. Her finger hovered for a second, as if making sure she was fully conscious of what she was about to do. Then she sent a single message, attached with the file she had guarded for days. The phone in Ethan's suit pocket vibrated. At first he didn't notice, maintaining his practiced social smile. But when he glanced down at the screen, his expression changed instantly. The confidence in his eyes gave way to panic, his breathing turning shallow as if the air in the room had suddenly grown too thick. The words and images on the screen needed no explanation. They were the test results he believed had been buried forever, proof of a truth he had concealed for years. Ethan tried to lock the screen, but his trembling hands betrayed him. The wine glass in his grip tapped lightly against the table, a small sound yet sharp enough to draw a few curious glances. He stepped back instinctively, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. His mother sensed something was wrong and leaned in to whisper something, but Ethan was no longer calm enough to hear her. In front of hundreds of guests, partners who once admired him, Ethan began to lose control. He adjusted his tie, then tugged at it harshly as if it were tightening around his neck. The smile vanished completely, replaced by the rigid expression of a man on the verge of losing his carefully crafted facade. From a distance, Chloe watched in silence. She didn't need to say a single word. She knew this psychological blow wasn't meant to humiliate Ethan on the spot, but to plant his greatest fear deep inside him. When the truth is placed in the right setting, under bright lights and among a crowd, it doesn't need to be shouted. Its mere existence is enough to make someone who lives by lies collapse under the weight of the image he's worked so hard to protect. As the atmosphere in the hall began to grow heavy, a subtle disturbance appeared along a side aisle near the stage. A man stepped forward, his pace unhurried but his gaze steady, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Chloe recognized him instantly. Rick, the former driver who lingered in fragments of her past, a name she had heard but never had the chance to confront. His appearance made Ethan freeze. The panic in Ethan's eyes was no longer a fleeting reaction. It was real fear. Rick didn't rush. He positioned himself where many could see him, his voice low and clear when he was invited to speak. He admitted to a past relationship with Olivia, one hidden behind late-night drives and unexplained absences. Rick stated plainly that he was the biological father of the children, a truth Ethan had known far earlier than he ever admitted. A ripple of shock swept through the room. Stunned faces, whispered gasps spreading like waves. But what brought the entire space to a standstill was what Rick revealed next, the price he paid for knowing too much. He recounted how his rented room had been set on fire one night, an incident officially ruled an accident, but in reality, a brutal warning meant to silence him. Rick survived, but carried scars that could never be erased, on his body and in his memory. He lost more than a place to live. He lost his voice for a long time, forced into silence by fear. And in that frozen moment, the carefully built illusion finally began to crack, not from a single accusation, but from the slow, undeniable weight of truth rising to the surface. Ethan tried to interrupt, but every attempt fell flat as the crowd's attention had fully shifted to Rick. There was no shouting in his confession, no dramatic provocation, only the steady voice of a man who had endured more than enough. Standing there, Chloe realized that truth, when spoken by someone who has paid dearly just to survive, carries more weight than any act of revenge. And in that moment, the carefully staged performance Ethan had maintained for years began to crack in front of everyone. Before the crowd could fully process what they had heard, Ethan suddenly moved toward Chloe, his eyes completely out of control. The calm facade he had struggled to maintain throughout the evening collapsed in an instant. In a surge of panic and fury, he grabbed Chloe's wrist, his voice breaking as he repeatedly demanded that she stay silent. The action happened so fast that many guests only sensed that something was terribly wrong. Chloe didn't struggle. She looked straight at Ethan, allowing that moment to expose who he truly was in front of everyone. In his loss of control, Ethan blurted out the very truths he had believed would never come to light. He spoke of the staged death, the deliberate concealment of facts, The reckless choices made solely to protect his image and personal gain. These were no longer excuses. They were confessions forced out by overwhelming fear. What Ethan didn't know was that the entire moment was being broadcast live throughout the hall via a projection system that had been activated in advance. On the large screen, both image and sound played clearly, plunging the room into silence. Guests stood frozen, whispers vanished, replaced by collective shock as the truth unfolded before their eyes. When Ethan finally realized everything had slipped beyond his control, he released Chloe's wrist in panic. Chloe stepped back, took a deep breath, and steadied herself. She understood that from this moment on, the truth no longer belonged to her alone. It had been placed in full public view, where no one could continue to hide it or deny it. And in that instant, the balance of power in this story shifted completely. When law enforcement arrived and asked Ethan to cooperate, a heavy silence settled over the room. The eyes that had once looked at him with admiration now held only shock. Standing beneath the lights and before the crowd, Ethan's face drained of color as he realized every escape route had closed. He shook his head repeatedly, backing toward the edge of the space, as if still clinging to the belief that denial might save him. But what had just been broadcast publicly had erased any chance of that. Ethan refused to cooperate. His words came out disjointed, aimed at no one in particular, as though he were arguing with himself. In that moment, the image of the successful man he had carefully constructed completely collapsed, leaving only the panic of someone unwilling to face consequences. When he was ordered to stop, Ethan turned and glanced briefly at the crowd, his eyes passing over Chloe like a belated farewell. There was no apology, no spoken remorse. In just a few seconds, Ethan made his final choice. Rather than face the truth and legal responsibility, he stepped beyond the boundary of safety and chose to end everything himself. It happened so quickly that no one had time to react. Noise erupted, then fell silent. Chloe stood still, feeling a strange emptiness wash over her. Not satisfaction, not the pain she had once imagined, just the cold conclusion of a chain of lies that had lasted for years. That ending brought no victory to anyone, but it closed the cycle Ethan had created for himself. And in that moment, Chloe understood that some people would rather run to the very end than live long enough to face the truth they themselves brought into existence. After everything came to an end, those who had once stood behind Ethan could not escape the consequences of years of deception. Chloe's former mother-in-law, the woman who had controlled and orchestrated everything with absolute coldness, collapsed that very night. The shock was so severe that she suffered a massive stroke, leaving her permanently paralyzed. She survived, but lost the ability to speak or care for herself, trapped inside her own body. For someone who had once used words as weapons to wound others, that silence became the longest sentence of all. Olivia, the new wife who had believed she was living in a perfect family, was also forced to face total collapse. Once the truth was exposed, the powerful family behind her cut all ties to protect their reputation. Relationships built on status and prestige vanished overnight. Olivia lost her protection, her social standing, and was left to confront a life without the shield she had relied on. As for the assets, everything Ethan had built under his new identity was frozen and seized by authorities for investigation. The wealth once seen as success and power was revealed to be nothing more than the byproduct of deceit. No one inherited it fully. No one truly won. Chloe watched these endings quietly, from a distance. She felt no joy, no triumph. What unfolded felt more like a stark reminder. When people choose to build their lives on lies and the suffering of others, the price is never paid by one person alone. It spreads to everyone caught in that orbit. As time passed, Chloe's life settled into a different rhythm, calmer, yet more grounded. After everything she endured, she returned to work with an entirely new mindset. No longer a woman who bowed her head in silence, She was recognized for her professionalism, resilience, and the composure she had forged through years of hardship. Her promotion came without fanfare, but it was well earned. It wasn't just recognition of her abilities, it marked the moment she truly stood back up on her own, supported by no one but herself. Outside of work, Chloe chose a simple, peaceful life. She moved to a new place, filled with light, quiet, and most importantly, free from memories that once weighed her down. Her mornings began with a cup of coffee and moments of stillness just for herself. Her evenings ended with a sense of safety she had never truly known before. Chloe learned to value the present, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let it continue controlling her emotions. One day, Chloe received a message asking her to visit her former mother-in-law, who was now bedridden, unable to speak or express her wishes. Chloe read the message for a long time. There was no hatred left in her heart, but there was no attachment either. In the end, she gently declined. Not out of resentment, but because she understood that forgiveness does not always require returning. That decision brought Chloe no guilt. Instead, it affirmed her final boundary of freedom. Some chapters in life must be fully closed so that a person can truly move forward. For Chloe, choosing peace for herself was not selfish. It was the greatest lesson she had learned after all the losses she had endured. When everything finally settled, Chloe understood that her story did not end with the downfall of others, but with her own awakening. Looking back on the road she had walked, she realized a simple yet painful truth. No lasting happiness can be built on someone else's tears. No matter how carefully lies are hidden, no matter how powerful money or status may seem, the truth always exists quietly, waiting for the day it emerges. Ethan's fate was not a victory for Chloe. It was a clear reminder that the price of living a lie always comes due sooner or later. Chloe also learned that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is survival. It is healing. It is preparation for the day when one is strong enough to speak. For 5 years, Chloe remained silent, not because she accepted injustice, but because she lacked the means to protect herself. And when the time came, her voice did not need anger or noise. It only needed to stand in the right place at the right moment and let the truth speak for itself. This story is not meant to encourage revenge or extreme confrontation. It is a reminder that justice may arrive late, but it is never absent. Sometimes justice does not appear in the form we expect, yet it always leaves a mark, forcing people to take responsibility for what they have done. If you followed this story to the end, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Perhaps you, or someone close to you, is staying silent in the face of injustice, enduring alone. Remember this: your value is not defined by how you are treated, but by how you choose to rise. If this story offered you a new perspective, please subscribe to the channel to continue listening to real-life stories filled with reflection and meaning. And don't forget to leave a comment, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.